A very warm welcome to Saïd Business School for the third and final of the 2017 Clarendon lectures, the 21st in the series of Clarendon Lectures in Management lecture series organized in conjunction between Oxford University Press and Saïd Business School. For those who haven't been able to join us before, every year we invite a distinguished management speaker to speak on the broad topic of management, education, leadership and business. And I'm very pleased to welcome that this year's speaker is Professor Herminia Ibarra, the Charles Handy Professor of Organisational Behaviour at London Business School at the moment. On Tuesday, for those of you who couldn't join us, Herminia talked us through the uplifting stories of the possible selves that we might be fashioning ourselves into, but also the vagaries of getting stuck in between in situations of career change. And if I may summarize, one of the key taglines of the talk was probably, "We are what we do." And what we do a lot at work. Yesterday, she then expanded this into thinking about what if the leadership, or if the identities we fashion are actually transitions into leadership, the links between leadership and identity. And today she's bringing those two together in, I think, an eerily timely discussion about identity dynamics and women's leadership advancement. And I think we're currently looking at an environment where maybe we have to ask ourselves, what if organizations or broader society around us doesn't like the identity I want to assume, doesn't like the identity I bring to an organization? If what we are, what we do, what if organizations don't let me do what I don't want to do to become who I want to be? And so I'm particularly pleased to welcome Professor Ibarra to the floor to discuss identity dynamics, women's leadership advancement, the obstacles that face, and why it is that women are still underrepresented in leadership positions in large organizations. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Good evening. It's really nice to see the mix of familiar faces from the other lectures and some new faces. And thank you if you've been here for the duration. I really much appreciate that. That was a fantastic introduction. Absolutely, as Michael described, we started out talking about in the first lecture about how much the "you are what you do" truism is true, how intertwined our identities are with the work that we do, and how that tight connection can sometimes make it hard for us to move on to a new career or to move up into more senior leadership roles, as we talked about yesterday, and how much these possible selves, these future identities that start out just as in our minds as possibilities, are so much a part of the change process, and how transition, for better or worse, is a process of trying those out and experimenting with them. Today we're going to talk about how the larger context in which these possible selves form and how much that context is affected by the demographic composition of the context, majorities and minorities. Now, a lot of the dynamics that I'm going to talk about could apply to all different kinds of minorities and majorities. It so happens that most of my work has been around gender dynamics, and so majorities and minorities with regard to gender. But certainly when we come to Q&A, we can talk about how that might apply and how intersectionality complicates things. But I'm going to focus primarily on gender. And, really to start things off, we're constantly bombarded with images about who's a leader, right? So this was an easy recent lift. These are among the best paid CEOs in the FTSE 100, not a single woman around them. And, we've grown familiar with the Manels and all the other contexts, and it's extraordinarily pervasive in ways that we often don't even realize. And one way that I had never given any thought before kind of came to light because of the recent, I guess how to describe it, the recent hullabaloo in the United States about the Confederate statues and taking them down. And it turns out, and I learned this in a fascinating New York Times article, that there's also a bronze ceiling for women. It's this fantastic article about women on pedestals, that is, women as statues, with the wonderful quote, "To be made a statue, a woman had to be a naked muse, royalty, or the mother of God." And in fact, people have been studying this, and there is indeed a bronze ceiling. If you look at statues in England, in Britain, 158 are women standing on their own, because women often don't get to stand on their own. They'll be in groups out of 925. Most of those are not real, they're allegories. 29 are Queen Victoria, so she was really the standard bearer of it all. Only 2.7% are historical women who are not royalty, one of whom is a ghost and only there because she's looking for the spirit of her murdered husband, and 43 are men called John. Right? So, you know, this was completely eye-opening to me, a completely new sphere. But wherever we look, whether in the art world, in media, whatever, we are confronted with this issue of the fact that, subtly or not so subtly, we're told that we as women are not the prototype of leaders. And then it shows up in the context that I study, which are large business organizations, where you see women enter in large numbers, and that will vary by industry, but in many industries, women are coming out in larger numbers out of law school, in larger numbers out of accounting, in many different areas. They enter in big numbers, often 50-50 in organizations, and then something happens in the middle. There's a big drop-off. What's happening there? And the thing is, there's been now, by this point, tons of investment in this. And companies have flexible policies and women's networks and this and that, and none of it really works. And that has been shown. This is from a cover story in the Harvard Business Review last year. These things are not especially working. So what do we do? So I study how people move, particularly kind of mid-career, at that mid-level of the pyramid, how people move from earlier in their careers where they've been successful as technical experts, as functional experts, especially experts, and we talked a lot about this yesterday, into roles that often mean moving up, not always, and that require a different skill set. Hence, the what got you here won't get you there. And I thought, well, what if we start looking at some of these gender dynamics a little more holistically? There's been loads of fantastic research on the glass ceiling, and I can't even begin to cover it in 45 minutes, but I thought, what if we apply an identity and transition lens and start to look, we talked about this yesterday, what helps people move up and get through these transitions, and how that involves redefining the work they do so it's more strategic, extending their networks, and being more playful with their sense of self so that they can try on styles that are different, perhaps more leaderly in some way. And if you take these three categories, which we talked about yesterday, which really are the things that help people develop their leadership, assume a leadership identity, be recognized for it, acquire the competence and skills. If you look at these, they correspond almost perfectly to the elements that come together to form what we call second-generation bias. And second-generation bias simply says, this is what happens today as a result of not explicit discrimination, although that still occurs. It occurs less. But second-generation bias is that something in the water that you can't quite put your finger on, but means that you end up seeing less. They just fall off like flies. And it has to do with the way career paths are gendered, and work roles and departments and industries, and who gets shuttled into what kinds of work. It has to do with networks and relationships, and it has to do with cultural stereotypes. And each of these is going to correspond, actually, these barriers, they're going to correspond exactly, really, to the categories of things that people have to work on as they're developing their leadership, and things that organizations have to help them with. And so I'm going to take each of these three in kind. In some cases, I have some potential practical solutions, in others not. But the point I want to make is that they form a system that is going to make the normal process of becoming a leader, of starting to internalize a leadership identity, because you're doing leadership work, you're recognized as doing it by the people around you, it's kind of endorsed, you're viewed that way more reputationally, all that process is going to get complicated for women as they're moving up because of these three issues that I'm going to talk about now. Okay? I'm going to start first with access to the kinds of assignments that develop your strategic perspective, get you in touch with the right people, and end up being those things on your CV that when it comes time to move into the more senior roles, you tick the box. And that is the single biggest barrier. And that is the single hardest thing to intervene in, which is why companies haven't necessarily focused on this. And I had the biggest aha on this topic a few years ago when I was on a panel for this thing called the Top Companies for Leadership. It's a Hewlett Fortune study that happens every year. And I was on the panel, and companies that wanted to be nominated had to put in these big files and dossiers about everything they were doing to develop leaders. And one of the things that almost all of the top companies reported was this idea of the 70-20-10 model, which is an old saw in HR. It basically says that people develop on the job by doing, not in business school, not in training, not in being coached, but they develop in stretch assignments by doing things. And so all the companies who were postulating for these top companies for leaders talked about all the things they were doing on the 70% to get people into the assignments that would stretch them and develop them and grow their leadership capacity. Now, in those, there was a set kind of thing the companies had to fill out, and in that dossier there was a special box for what are you doing to make sure you develop a diverse set of leaders. And in most of these companies, the key concern was women leaders. They had too few. What do you think they wrote about what they were doing to develop the women leaders? Training, mentoring program, after having written on and on about the fact that the action was over here. Now, if you start looking at this, a few years ago, McKinsey started putting out these Women Matter reports, and one of the things they immediately hit on, that the biggest barrier to getting more women into executive committees in the Fortune 500 companies was that if you looked at the level right below, they were primarily in HR and communications and the staff roles that don't lead to the senior roles. And what they actually found is if you look at earlier, not entry level, but early managerial levels, women were only, across these companies, were only 28% staff. But as they move up, they start moving increasingly into support roles that don't lead to the top. And organizations who were just counting how many do we have at each level were completely missing the boat that the pipeline wasn't there because they were there numerically at the levels, but not with the experience needed to kind of move up. Now, as the 2008 financial crisis hit, and there were fewer promotions to be had, there was a big study by Catalyst looking at how people use projects, task forces, assignments, and how they're used by companies to develop their leadership. And it turned out that projects are also another way in which people develop their leadership. And particularly when promotions or transfers to a full new job are not available. And here's what they found. Women got more of the hot projects. Everybody was using projects to develop, but men's projects had bigger budgets, more staff, more C-suite visibility, and more international scope. And this is a study across many countries and many companies. And so there's something really critical about what is the work that men and women are doing in these organizations and how that work actually prepares you for more senior roles. There are occasional case studies that are encouraging. So here was a study looking at in depth at one law firm that actually managed to get to 50-50 at the partner level. And law firms are interesting because if you look at this, they start out with many more women at the entry level of the pipeline, and then it dramatically drops off, whereas men are fewer, and it moves up, right? And what they found here is if you pay close and devoted attention at the top to the assignments process. In this case, the senior partner was actually focusing and assigning those cases and making sure women got the hot stuff with the key clients. That is exactly how they got to 50-50. Just to throw out another tidbit, because I really want to cover the three areas, some colleagues at MIT looked at what they called the initial assignment effect. This is also in law firms. What they started out saying is, isn't it a shame that some of the practices that companies put into place to make sure that they keep women, like work-life flexibility practices, end up actually hurting their chances of moving up, having paradoxical effects. And what they found here is that assignment to powerful supervisors, so getting assigned to the people who were the head honchos, the real rock stars in these firms early on in people's careers, had effects that pervaded throughout. And in fact, the women who were able to do well, stay, get paid highly, were the ones who had these assignments to powerful people early in their careers. And those initial supervisors were the ones that mattered, not the ones that they had at the moment when they were taking advantage of those policies. And the mechanism was that having worked for powerful people, they got access to better and better assignments, better and better projects that better and better develop their leadership. So the key and the starting point is really looking at what kinds of work, what departments, what areas are men and women going into. Now, the flip side of it, as we talked about yesterday, is what you do affects the quality of your network, because it affects who you get to know and how they get to know you. And this is an area, there's some questions about that in yesterday's lecture. We know a lot about how gender affects networks, and gender in the sense, again, of numerical representation, majorities and minorities, because the biggest principle of network formation is birds of a feather. Likes go with like, similarity attracts, not opposites. And that has been a dominant cause of difference that I'm going to talk about, as well as a few things. So starting with the birds of a feather effect, this was an effect that I studied very early on in my career when I focused on informal networks in organizations. And the idea that likes attract had been fairly well shown, but its effects were not all that clear. And what I was able to show with my data is that what happens is, if you have a context in which women are underrepresented, men have a context in which they don't have to trade off someone like me for someone who has power. They can get both in the same person. Whereas for women, if I want to have professional relationships with people who are like me on some significant dimension, that's one person, and the person who has the power to promote me is another. So what I saw is that women's networks were more bifurcated, functionally differentiated from men's. What you had with men is not always, okay, so this is statistically not always, but men's networks were more likely to overlap between the work and the social. Whereas women had one set of contacts for work and a different set of contacts for social. Not everybody, and this had some real effects. Right? This had some real effects. The effect was, well, think about it. What happens when your networks are bifurcated, when you have two separate networks, one work and more social? What happens?
To pick one or the other, it's hard to stay in between.
It's hard to stay in between. It's definitely not so time efficient, that's for sure. What else happens? Yeah?
You lose out on all of the credibility and the social capital that you would have if the people you were working with were your personal friends as well as your professional.
You lose out on something. You lose out on something for sure. Maybe you're less up on the gossip. Maybe you have fewer opportunities to kind of pitch your idea in an informal setting. And something happens when people get to see you across different spheres. They see you sweat, they see you laugh, they see you in different contexts. Trust grows. There's less uncertainty about who you are. You become a kind of like a full flesh and blood person. You're not a stick figure. People feel like they really know you. But the fact of the matter is that these are very, very bifurcated. One of the stories I always like to tell, I was at INSEAD Business School until just very recently, and in terms of the people at my level, my peers, my age, for a long time I was the only woman, and my colleagues, what they did after work, and if you're in Fontainebleau, there's not that much to do. What they did is play football and then go to the sauna. And they always invited me to come along, but I didn't go. And so, but what happened was I'd often be the last one to know what was going on. I'd have to kind of make an effort to sort of find out, but that's what happens here. So this is kind of a starting point. Once most of the people around you, and particularly those who have power and influence, are different from you, there is a lot more work to be done in terms of establishing relationships that are high trust, and there's more questioning even to be done. How much do I share of me? So that's a starting point. A second point when it comes to networks has to do with mentoring relationships. And we did a study here in collaboration with Catalyst, who surveyed alumni of all the top business schools, or as many as they were able to get into. I actually don't know if they included Oxford in that study, but INSEAD was a part. And so we did a first survey in 2008 where we asked people about their mentoring relationships. And then there was a follow-up survey in 2010, and one of the things we looked at was promotion, and then we looked at how well does having a mentor predict getting promoted in 2008, predict getting promoted in 2010, and it turned out that it did, but only for men, not at all for women. And so we started to dig a little bit more. Women's mentors were less senior. Women's mentors were more likely to be female, and it wasn't the fact they were female, but by virtue of the fact that they were female, they were less senior. And the dynamic was a little bit different. In some of the qualitative work that we did, we started teasing out what's happening in these relationships. And I'll show you a quote from one of the mentees that I interviewed. He said, "My boss said, you're ready for a general management job. You can do it. Now we need to find you a job. What are the tricks we need to figure out? I have to talk to this person. You have to talk to that person." He said they were all executive committee members. Very much block and tackle. Now, here's a woman talking about her mentor. "My mentor's idea of a development plan was how many meetings I could travel to and get exposure, how many presentations I could deliver. I just hate these things that add work. I mean, I hate to say it, I'm busy. I have 3 kids. I'm trying to get through to him that what my current boss wants is for me to focus on breakthrough thinking. And I want to do that. It's quite funny because I'm going to be in a wheelchair by the time I get to be vice president because they're going to drill me into the ground with all these extra credit projects." So, the women over-mentored, under-sponsored. Lots of talk, lots of advice, lots of extracurricular, do this self-assessment, do that, do this other thing. Who do you want to be authentic, be yourself, how can I help? But none of this, like, okay, how do we get from A to B? You got to go here and then there, and this is how we do it, right? And so, since then we've talked a lot about the differences between mentors and sponsors. Mentors want to help and give advice. Sponsors have power and will use it for you, and it doesn't matter how close the relationship is or not. And we know it's been harder for women to have mentors, but that's what it takes because what you want is people talking about you, promoting you in rooms where you wouldn't be, in conversations where you wouldn't be. And so that has been the name of the game. That's been controversial, by the way, because a lot of people have asked, how can I appoint a sponsor? A sponsor has to spend his political capital on you. And so if I actually say, you don't know Herminia, but you're going to be her sponsor, is that simply some kind of affirmative action plan? So it's been hard. People have now understood that this is a critical dynamic, but it's been hard to dictate it. Now, on the positive side, one of the things that we know is that women's external networks can be incredibly helpful both to their current performance and to their advancement. And again, it's because of numbers and homophily. For example, one of my colleagues, Boris Groisberg, who studied stars and how portable stars are. I don't know how familiar you are with his work, but his most famous study, he took institutional investor-rated analysts, and he looked at what happened when they switched to other firms, when they went to work somewhere else. And what happened was, inevitably, they lost in the rankings. And it took them about 3 years to work their way up to where they were. So their star talent wasn't just about them. It had a lot to do with the context and the people around them that was making them be stars. That's why it took them a while to recoup that when they went somewhere else. It turned out that that pattern didn't hold for women. Women did not lose in the ratings when they moved to another firm. Can you guess why? Do I have it up there? Yeah. Yeah. The reason was that women's success was based on different kinds of networks. They were more external. They were more to do with clients. There were parts of the firms that were maybe less high status, but they had been able to build relationships with, and so therefore their networks were more portable. There's loads of other research that shows that basically women need different kinds of networks to succeed, again, because of this majorities and minorities homophily effect. In some studies of law firms, for example, it's been shown that when the firm has more women clients, women are more likely to be promoted to partner. And again, a similar effect is going on. So lots of things that have to do with networks. The third part that I want to talk about, so the work, what you do, the networks, who you do it with, and how that shapes and forms you. And then the third bit has to do with implicit bias, perceptions, explicit bias, gender stereotypes, and how that comes into play, how that affects what jobs we get offered and get channeled into, how that affects the networks, and ultimately also what we start to internalize about what's possible, what's desirable, what's feasible, what kind of leader we want to be. That bias, as I said, is all around us. This is one of my favorite images. For a few years, I was going often to Zurich for different things that had to do with talking about how the world of business has changed, and now it's all about collaboration and a different model and a much more female model. And every time I walked into the airport, I saw this poster, which basically says, maybe, but at the heart of it, the real leader or the real man is the one who doesn't need a co-pilot. And you can find images like this everywhere. I especially like this one. Lots of different aspects to this. In performance appraisal, we see it in spades. There's been a lot of talk about this. The whole thing got kicked off by a very non-academic study. There's somebody in Silicon Valley who said, I'm going to reach out to all my friends and I'm going to ask them to send their performance reviews. And I'm going to analyze the performance reviews and see what happens, men and women. And this is what she found. Women got more critical, subjective feedback that is not specific, more about who you are, more negative personality criticism. Watch your tone, step back, don't be so judgmental. That showed up in 71 of the 94 reviews she got versus twice in the 83 reviews that she had for men. Words like bossy, abrasive, strident, aggressive were used to describe women's behaviors when they led. Words like emotional and irrational describe their behaviors when they objected, right? So it really kicked off a whole set of, now there's more academic studies kind of looking into this, but it's cropping up everywhere. Just recently in the Harvard Business Review, there was a study of, it was kind of an ethnographic study. Somebody had been sitting in meetings by VCs evaluating projects, and here's the difference in how the male entrepreneurs and the female entrepreneurs were being described by these VCs. Young and promising, young but inexperienced, extremely capable, very driven, lacks ability for venturing and growth. I'll let you read. But in many cases, the same behaviors, the same attributes being described by very different words, right? Now, Callis has started to pinpoint how this is really kind of embedded at the heart of the talent management systems that a lot of organizations use, starting with hiring protocols, assessment, performance appraisal, and they kind of cascade through because these things were designed to be interlocking in talent management systems. And so some researchers are starting to try to pick it apart. The good news is we're at a time when the whole performance appraisal, annual performance appraisal enterprise has really come into question, and people are trying to use different things that turn out to be less gender bias. And so it seems that, and this is all kind of early days, but it seems that systems that are much more kind of close to the time when something happened, as opposed to once a year, have less bias attached to them, because the further away you are, the more likely you are to remember in gender bias terms. And also a lot of these systems are fed with gender neutral terms that people can use to describe behaviors. So it seems to be making a difference. But the point of this is that this is not an individual bias, the bias is embedded at the very heart of the systems that are being used by organizations to select and to promote and to assess performance. Now, there's a whole set of biases having to do with how we assess performance. There's also even more bias in how we assess potential, because as you know, organizations try to differentiate between how you've done to date in what you're doing, but how might you do in something completely different, which is an extrapolation. That's potential, and it turns out that, of course, that is extremely gender biased. And here I want to share a little bit of research from some 360-degree assessment data that we collected when I was at INSEAD in executive education. We started giving these instruments to the executives coming in and collected, at the time of this study, we had about 3,000 executives who had come through and about 25,000 data points from their observers who had filled out this 360-degree instrument. And these were the categories. These were the categories on which they were assessed. Now, the question I had is, well, let's try to cut it by gender and see what happens. Do women rate themselves differently than do men on these categories? Do you think they did? Do you think women rated themselves differently than men? Higher or lower? Yeah, that's what everybody guesses, but guess what? They didn't. They rated themselves, in fact, slightly higher on some of the dimensions, some equally. You have to say this was an executive education population in which probably women were like 15%, so you could argue that it was a slightly different kind of category. But they rated themselves higher, if not the same. When I looked at the observers who rated them, who filled out the ratings, do you think the observers rated them higher or lower? No, wrong again. They rated them higher. So this is, my academic article was completely destroyed, by the way, because nothing was coming out as it was supposed to. And when I cut the observers by their gender, do you think women were rated higher or lower by their male observers or by their female observers? Who rated them lower, the females or the males? Yeah, that's what we think too. And in fact, no, the women rated them even higher. So none of it came out. These were incredibly competent women across the board. The thing was, there was one problem. There was one dimension on which they were really taken down. They were really scoring lower, significantly lower. What do you think it was? Envisioning. Why? Who said? Correct. It was envisioning. This was the dimension. It had to do with sensing opportunities and threats in the environment, setting strategic direction, and then kind of inspiring people to do things differently. And women were being rated lower on this. And by the way, only by men, not by their women observers. So what's going on here? And you know, it's only one dimension, but in other studies, this is the dimension on which leadership potential gets assessed. Does this person have a point of view, strategic acumen, capacity to connect the dots, right? It is more important for assessments of leadership potential than others. So what's happening? So here we got into a bit more qualitative work and started to ask people what was going on. And it starts coming down to a lot of issues about identity. This was not a highly scientific study. We're just asking people. But there were a few things that came out. First of all, a number of people said women who develop a vision collaboratively don't get credit for it, right? And I've seen that, and particularly when I'm using case studies about more collaborative versus less collaborative leaders, that very much holds. The other two were related and quite interesting. A number of women said, look, you know, I'm not going to go out with this airy-fairy stuff because I'm just going to be chopped off at the knees. It's much safer to stick to the facts. I'm bulletproof on that, and so that's what I'm doing. Now, let me just say as an aside, what got you here won't get you there. It might have kept you safe for quite some time, but is that going to be helpful moving forward? And identity was very much related to it because many of the women that I spoke to in trying to really understand these results say, you know, basically, I'm the COO type. I get it done. I execute. No nonsense. Close to the ground. You know, none of this sort of rhetorical BS about vision. I kind of make things happen. But what happens when you have that kind of identity? And how can that hold you back? Just very recently, there was another very interesting article in the New York Times interviewing women who almost made it to the CEO role in large companies but didn't. I don't know if anybody saw this. And they interviewed some that actually did. And one of the quotes in that article really made me think of this. One woman said, if what would be written on my gravestone is dependable backup. Dependable backup. And that's what was happening here. Now, if you convey dependable backup, and people are primed to see you as dependable backup, which, by the way, who doesn't love a dependable backup, right? What happens to then potentials, assessments of your potential? So this for me is a big one. The other bit, and this particular a little bit earlier on in our careers, we talked about this yesterday. Authenticity is a big deal today. We talk about it a lot. We aspire to it. We want it. We certainly want to see that in our leaders. But the problem is, as we start to move into roles that are new, that are unfamiliar, and that are actually taking us from stuff and content and expertise to communication and vision and some of these more intangible things, people inevitably start to feel a bit fake, a bit, this is not me. I don't know how to do those. It's not just I don't know how to do that, it isn't me. And I did a study quite a number of years ago looking at young consultants and investment bankers as they started to move from analytic roles, transaction management roles, project management roles, into more client advisory, rainmaking, really working with senior clients. And all of them experienced that as a challenge because they didn't feel credible, they didn't feel competent, and they certainly didn't feel competent to have the conversations that their senior clients wanted to have with them, which were not about the details, but hey, what do you think's happening with the G20, or these kind of broad issues. And so they went about that a few different ways. Essentially what they did was kind of see who's good at this, how do they do it. And most of them just did the chameleon thing and imitated them. They stole their jokes, they stole the way they talked, the way they walked, their styles, many different things because, hey, I don't know how to do it, so I'm going to do it like her because she knows what she's doing, and let's just see what happens. And I told a story about myself doing something very similar yesterday. Others said, can't do that, got to be true to myself, right? So one learning cycle was, let's see who does this well. Let's see what I can steal from them, try it on, and in trying it on, I'm going to see what fits and what doesn't. I'm going to iterate, I'm going to learn, I'm going to make it my own. That was one learning trajectory. The true to self learning trajectory was, she may be amazing with clients, but that's not me. I don't have that sense of humor. She's way too aggressive. I can't be that way. Whatever it was, I got to be true to myself. The problem was, in being true to themselves, they hit the what got you here won't get you there. They were trying to be good client advisors by being good students, by being good analysts. And what happened was they limited themselves in two ways. One is they didn't get feedback on what they were doing from their senior people because it looked like they were not doing anything. And they didn't get feedback from themselves about whether this works or doesn't work. It was a slower learning process. Now, if I cut it by gender, where did you think I had more of the women? In the chameleon strategy or the true to self? True to self. Now, is it because women care more about authenticity than men? No, it was because the role models were very different. Because the role models didn't fit. Because they would look up at the senior, the successful, and they'd say, I don't want to be like him. Even if I acted like him, it wouldn't work the same for me. And so I've got to figure something else. It slowed the learning process, and it created what I ended up calling, seeing it much later with senior executives, the authenticity paradox. And the authenticity paradox is dangerous for all of us, but particularly at those what got you here won't get you there moments. Because what happens is you start to see a situation in which you have a trade-off between being yourself and doing what it takes to be successful, right? If I'm just myself, kind of sticking to the facts, very no nonsense, none of that rhetoric, none of that posturing, I'm not going to be successful. If I try to do that, I'll feel like a fake. often happens in a situation where your identity, your self-definition is tied to skills, to things that are what brought you here, that are historical. But at the same time, there's a bit of ambivalence about the transition. Am I going to have to sell out? Am I going to have to violate something key about who I am? Can I be successful here? Can I belong? And when you have those things combined, what actually happens, and a lot of the people who describe to me in great rhetorical flourish how important it was for them to be authentic, what they were actually describing wasn't an authentic self. It was a rigid, scared self, a nervous self, not a self in full power. And I call that the authenticity paradox, because in trying to be authentic, they were actually keeping themselves from growing and developing into the next authentic version of themselves. And this is something that happens much more in contexts in which you get somehow the message don't quite belong because the numbers are not in your favor. Having identified that, I looked a little bit into the literature on this, and in fact there's quite a bit of evidence that says that authenticity is more an outcome than an input, and that in fact authentic self-expression, being yourself, is much more likely to happen when you feel security, when you have power. One of the key articles on this was called The Power to Be Me. If you have power, of course you can self-express. It's much easier, and when you feel accepted. And so a lot of this is very much contextual, much more than we actually realize when we're going through it. So just to start to pull this together and to make sure that we have some time for Q&A, these unseen barriers are really the building blocks of our future selves, of our future identities, the jobs that we do that expand our minds, that actually open up those possibilities, the networks that kind of open the doors and show the way, allow us to know what we need to know in order to succeed, and then the context in which our image and identity and reputation develop, they come together and they're very, very much affected by the context in which it all happens. And so just to kind of wrap this up, if becoming a leader, as we've been talking about, is very much an identity transition in which you come to see yourself as a leader and others come to see you as such. And it's one that's very much going to be endorsed and validated by getting those key assignments, by getting sponsored, by getting networked in, by being seen as having the right stuff. These things work together, either in a positive cycle where you strengthen your identity as a leader. Gosh, I got that job. This person's helping me out. I'm really seen as a go-getter, as a person with high potential, or the other way around, And so if we're going to be intervening as organizations, those are the levers that we have to get to until we start to see this as a matter of identity. And identity is not just how you see yourself, it's also how others see you. The two of them come together. Unless we start to see this as a puzzle about identity and about transition, I think it's going to be hard to move those numbers. So I'm going to stop here so we have time for some Q&A. What do you think?
Thank you. So in organizations where sectors of it either have a lack of women in leadership roles, or there's still controversy about women ascending into those leadership roles, where in effect there's only men really around who are peers, let's say, in the lower level management positions. How can men serve as better allies, or in your words, mentors and sponsors for women to help, where they can break the mold?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely critical. This doesn't, it doesn't happen if only women are working on it. I mean, I think understanding some of these dynamics and understanding that it's, it's not because you're biased or your colleague is biased, but there's a real interlocking system that is really a system, and that it's subtle because nobody's trying to do anything in particular. It's just the way things work. And once you start opening your eyes to that, you can call it out.
Thank you very much for this very excellent presentation. It's very interesting because I recently graduated from law school, and before starting off law school, I read the book by Sheryl Sandberg, but I haven't had a chance to read your book, so maybe I'll try that today.
Next.
But so in the book, as well as there was recently an article talking about how women are starting to ask for more raise and things that they want, but how, just as in your presentation you pointed out, how that behavior is being perceived as aggressive or like too assertive, if there's such thing. But so how should we deal with this kind of situation where we're encouraged to ask for things that we want, but when we do, we're perceived negatively?
Right. So that's viewed as the double bind. It's called the double bind, and it's not a good bind to be in. And, there's been a whole cottage industry of books and courses about how to negotiate for races as a result of Sheryl Sandberg and other things. And there are plenty of good tips about how to do it. And, on the one hand, it's great to be informed so that you can increase the likelihood of getting that. And part of it has to do with posing it as a kind of a win-win and what the organization has to gain from it and not just yourself. But there's another side of it, because that's just one example of contexts in which women get taxed with a lot of extra work. How do I, study up so that I can ask for that raise and not be viewed as too aggressive? Or, it's the Goldilocks, too hot, too cold. How do you get that just right? And there's work that shows that it's really taxing on our systems. And if we're spending a lot of time just kind of trying to figure out how do I be tough but smile a lot too, so that I'm also kind of, it gets in the way of just getting things done and getting on with the work. And so there's a real fine line between not being naive and understanding these dynamics and understanding that how you're perceived matters, but still not spending all of your time managing an image that you can't, because you can't win. The research shows that we're always evaluating people on their competence and their likability or their warmth, and that it's a lot harder for women to be seen as both at the same time. It's one or the other. If you spend your whole life managing that, it's going to be really hard to get things done. So it's, I guess I'm saying, do both, or yeah, toe the line.
Thank you very much. I just want to kind of follow up with that gentleman's question about how you have allies that are men. Women are also allies to each other, and I'm in an organization where for the first time we took in more females than males, and the males who've been previously hired in the group quickly said, well, what happened to gender equality? And instantly that spurred sort of my emotional inner need to tell them that this is not gender equality. What you're talking about is gender presence in the organization. So, and then all of a sudden I received a separate message like, why are you attacking me personally? Why is this an issue? I think this is something else, and you're X, Y, and Z. And so how do you sort of navigate that, and how, instead of asking for a raise in this situation, you're trying to be an ally and also state that these people are hired because of their qualifications and because we need them in an organization, and how do you kind of navigate that and get the men on board? And also just sideline, this is not in the Western countries, so this is in sort of Central Asia oriented. So there's a cultural
but
aspect as well.
It happens everywhere.
Yeah.
I've had plenty of situations where my MBA students get labeled nastily with the F word, the feminist word, because they've called something out. So it does happen everywhere. And so how do you make sure you get people on board and educate them, but at the same time not get yourself ostracized and labeled? And and that's another area where we have a tax because there are ways to do it. There's been some colleagues at Stanford, at the Clayman Center for Gender Studies, that have been developing a methodology that they call C bias, block bias, and kind of giving people handy phrases and handy techniques and tactics that they can use when they hear something like this. What is it that you can say that's productive, that's going to open a conversation in a kind of a friendly and non-confrontational way, but that you can actually call it and say, hey, no, there's another way of looking at this. And so there's tactics and techniques for doing that.
Yesterday you talked a little bit about mimicking your advisor in your first university job at Harvard, I think, and kind of walking around the room in a way that he recommended. And I was wondering if there were any female leaders who you tried to kind of mimic or like be a chameleon with and use some of their strategies and what they did that you liked, or when you're talking to your female MBA students or mentees, who you recommended that they can kind of model themselves after, or does it really matter if you just model yourself after a man's leadership style?
Right. So The short answer is what I have found in my own experience and what the research suggests is that you're better off having a portfolio of different people that you have as role models, particularly for stylistic things. How do you convey presence and authority, or both authority and approachability, and do these subtle things that we need to do? The best thing is to observe a range of people and not conclude that the person who's most similar to you is necessarily going to have the technique for you. In fact, in the story that I told yesterday, the person I learned the most from couldn't have been more polar opposite on everything. On everything. But by kind of getting me to try something that was so far out of my comfort zone and so unlike anything I would do, I learned a lot. I didn't actually kind of keep it just that way. But I think learning from a broad portfolio of people is really useful. And the worst thing you can do is kind of get stuck in a search for the perfect role model, the one that, you know, I can really learn from and is a good human being and manages their work-life balance just right, and you can really kind of get behind everything they are. That is not going to be the most helpful approach.
Thank you for everything that you've said. I put in my time in Silicon Valley, so I really appreciate a lot of your insights. And sort of as a follow-up to some of the other questions that have been asked, one thing that the company I used to work at always seemed to struggle with, but perhaps failed to acknowledge, is the tax that you mentioned on women in terms of behavior and trying to fix these problems. A lot of sessions about this type of stuff in corporations particularly tend to be attended by women, and there is, as we all know, a certain level of backlash as well taking place against some of these diversity and inclusivity efforts.
As we know.
I actually worked at a company that had a pretty public event around this recently, which shall not be named. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions for sort of in a work setting, you know, whether it be top down or as a colleague, for drawing more people who do not belong to underrepresented groups into this discussion, into these sessions, in order that they can become allies.
Yeah. You know, what I've seen actually work best is sessions that have something in them for everybody that usually have to do with topics that everybody's interested in: how to advance your career, how to build up your network, how to, you know, how to negotiate salary. And so they're kind of general topics within which you can talk about how this might differ for different kinds of people and what things come into play. But there's something in it for everyone. I think those are the most inclusive conversations. I mean, there's a real bind. I mean, there's been studies that show that just making people aware of implicit bias makes it worse. And so we're trying to figure out what's the right balance here. I don't have all the answers myself, but I do often think it's around the more general topics that everybody wants to learn more about.
Thank you for a great series of lectures. I have actually just come back from the economics department, and I saw a seminar where a researcher looked at men and women who become mayors of towns in Sweden, which apparently is a very stressful job with a lot of responsibility. And she found that women who become mayors have a much greater risk of divorce afterwards, whereas the risk of divorce doesn't change for men who get these top jobs. And so my question is about partners, and I was wondering what you have seen in your work about the role of partners in negotiating these transitions, and to what extent can partners be a hindrance, or on the contrary, to what extent can they be a stimulus and a safety net in becoming a leader?
Yeah. Right. So the short answer is that I haven't looked at that. I have some colleagues at INSEAD who are doing some really fascinating work on dual career couples and how those dynamics play out. The lead author is Jennifer Petriglieri, and she's looking at when in a dual career situation, the two come to more than the sum of the parts, and how the relationships makes it more expansive for both. versus dual career couples that kind of frame the dual career situation as a trade-off. I take this hit, you take the next hit, and it's, you know, always somebody's going to be losing, but we're just going to manage to trade it off, as opposed to the more kind of synergistic. It's new research. It hasn't come out yet, and I look forward to it. But I think you're pointing to a really critical issue that doesn't get talked about very much, because oftentimes we talk about the work-family divide in terms of children, but also spouses or partners are a very big part of that, and they can be the biggest source of support, or it can also be the biggest source of tension. There is starting to be some research, but there isn't much of a mass of it yet. It's a good question.
So I've been working in an industry where the senior females often at times are viewed as being more male than the males, and the traits that they bring in. And the question I have is, how do we actually encourage women to leave the ladder behind and encourage women to actually grow, rather than having to take the same steps and make the same sacrifices that they had to make to get to the place in their career?
Right. Well, you know, mentors are always going to advise you according to their experience. And that's another reason why it's important not to have just one. And to, if the ones within your organization you consider to be in a kind of a traditional model that's no longer so relevant or not for you, you look outside and you take advice from people who are different. I mean, organizations are struggling with that. They realize that the success model for their senior people isn't necessarily going to be the one for the next generation coming through. They don't want to reproduce the same. They're trying to reinvent themselves. They're trying to go digital. They're trying to cope with a world that their most senior people don't understand. And so I think there's an openness to it. It's just, you know, it's just harder when it's not clear what the models are, and that's kind of what you have to cope with.
The organisation thinks that they've started actually on the right track, in that, you know, they are promoting more females, but it's actually not anyone that seniors want to work for, or that is actually a role model for everyone who's
Yeah.
that.
And by the way, that's a very tough position for those senior women to be in, because they feel quite isolated, and you know, they've done what they had to do. And they've done what was asked of them, and so they're oftentimes not a part of the club, and and they're not particularly sought after from the more juniors. So it's a lonely place to be.
Hi, thank you for the seminars. It's been illuminating. I have a question about quotas in boards. The European Commission has been talking about it. In my country, Portugal, there's a new law about it. Public companies have to have a third of women on the board pretty soon. What's your opinion about it? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I hear a lot of negative comments, mostly from women, about it.
Right, so that of course is one of the most controversial questions there is. You know, let's just say empirically we know that nothing changes until a quota is put in. So it kind of depends on, do you want change and how fast do you want it to go? It's a surefire way to get change. You know, you put it in, the numbers change completely. But beyond that, I have a few things to say. One is, you know, in no other arena would you expect to achieve anything if you didn't set a goal. Now, kind of a hard and fast target quota can be difficult. But you can set goals, and you can make them ambitious, and you can move them up, and you can make them transparent, and you can hold yourself to them. And so all of those things are tools that can be quite helpful. Now, you know, as far as I'm concerned, setting targets for boards, that's easy. What's really hard is the executive committee level. And those, you know, the numbers there are much worse, and interventions are much harder. That's what the UK is working on right now, after having made a lot of progress with regard to board representation. And there you can't, you cannot just kind of set up a quota, but you can certainly set goals that you hold people to. And if they don't meet them, you ask questions. If they don't meet them again, you ask harder questions, and that's how you make things advance. Yeah. So most people start out not being very much in favor, and as they look at what happens and as they try to create change and as they get progressively frustrated by the slow rate of progress, they become believers in them. That has been the trajectory for a lot of people I know.
I find it strange that a lot of the backlash is coming from women.
It comes from all over, I think.
So my question is actually kind of related to Sandra and Julie's question actually about, so I find that there are behaviors that are unappealing in both women and men. And yet, as like a female, how do you continue to support female leadership while also having the ability to be like, hey, like, I don't know if that's necessarily the right way to go about that? Because it seems like you're automatically pigeonholed by all the other women as, oh, you don't support women. And you're like, no, it's not that I don't support. So how do you navigate that type of scenario?
Right. You know, and of course that scenario is always harder when there's very few. If you only have one or two senior women and we're very vocally critical of them, well, it seems like we're being vocally critical of all womankind and all senior women's, and the beauty of having more is that you can see that they come in all shapes and sizes and stripes, and some are more appealing and some are less, and then it looks more like you're criticizing an individual rather than a whole block and category. But you know, for me, one of the very seminal pieces of work on this comes from one of my advisors, Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, who wrote a very famous book called Men and Women of the Corporation in the 1970s. And she said, if you actually look at behavior that we associate with being male and being female, in fact, it has very little to do with gender. It has to do with three things: power, opportunity, and numbers. When people have power, they behave differently. When they're a majority, they behave differently than if they were in a minority. And when they have a sense that they can have opportunity more, they behave very differently. And in fact, even in social psychology today, if you look at studies that have been done that have to do with power, these researchers will tell me you take out the variable power and you put gender instead, you get exactly the same kind of effects. And so when you look at this unpalatable behavior, it could just be the result of power corrupting and not necessarily being the result of this is a woman, but because we see a woman and we don't expect a woman in power to be the right kind of role model, then we code it very, very differently. And so we've got to be aware of that.
I have a question about business schools. So you mentioned at INSEAD being the only woman in the professorship, and Saïd is, I think, trying hard, but there's a similar kind of small number in our core faculty, and some of the examples that our professors use are quite sort of reinforced negative gender stereotypes. So both as students at school, but also more broadly, how do you see the role of business schools in moving the conversation forward?
Right. So, you know, we focus on the number of women on boards or the number of women in the FTSE 100. And my whole point in starting out with the whole thing about the statues and the bronze ceiling is that we should look at this much more broadly. And faculty, what is the role of business schools and what is the role of search firms? And even in business schools, it's not just the number of women on the faculty. Who comes to give the talks, you know, the business talks, and who's in the case studies that we use, and who's a protagonist? Women are vastly underrepresented as protagonists in best-selling cases. And so there is an entire ecosystem. And we've got to look at all of it. And in fact, it all works together. When none of the ecosystem is reinforcing the image of women in leadership and in power, it's very hard to feel a sense of belong and a sense of progress. And when it all starts to come together, it is hugely empowering. I mean, there have been studies that show that just putting portraits of powerful women on the walls, women leaders, women heads of states, makes an enormous difference in people's sense of belonging and of possibility. So there's a lot we can do across the board while doing some of the things that might take longer.
Hi. As students who are about to graduate and have new jobs and have that opportunity for new initial projects, do you have any recommendations for what we can do to make sure we are getting those initial projects that lay a good foundation for a career?
Well, I think in any interview process, you're learning about the organization and its culture and what it values and where interesting things are happening and where the hot spots are and what are kind of like the sexy areas. And you want to try to get in on those kinds of things.
Thank you so much for this. For the most part of your talk, I actually felt like you were just describing my life in corporate world. I came from a very, very male-dominated area, and what I realized was when the guys are moving in packs, they act very differently from when you get them one-on-one. Yeah. So one-on-one, they were some of the biggest advocates for women behind the scenes. But once we were on the job, they were extremely different. So how do you, as a woman, minority, even more minority, move men out of such hiding and get them really involved at a firm level in, you know, practices that ensure that women are a little bit more high up there, rather than just, you know, them feeling like they're out of the pack now and they don't want to put their faces out there like that. Yeah.
Right. So it's tough, in precisely by what you described, the kind of the pack and the group mechanism. I think a lot of what we can do is just kind of share some of our stories and some of our experiences, and oftentimes, you know, our male colleagues are genuinely surprised and amazed by some of the things that happen to us and some of the things that are said to us, and it raises their sense of injustice, and they want to help, and so there is a lot of awareness raising that we can do. The question is, how does it then translate into maybe more collective action, and what can happen at a more sort of systemic level? And I don't know the answer to that. By the way, that's the hot area right now for several you have asked, is how do we, I mean, this is where you started, how do we actually not kind of ghettoize and divide everybody up into their identity group, but kind of bring everybody together into the conversation so that we learn from each other. And I think everybody's trying to learn how to do that now, because that's happening at the same time as this kind of diversity fatigue that is blowing up in the Googles and so on of the world. And so I think it's kind of a work in progress. I could say some trite things, but I actually don't know what the answer is.
We've talked a lot about men and women, so women maybe struggling to work with men. How do we tackle the women that we work with who also, that we struggle with, that maybe senior leaders who see as competition? And I mean, I've had it in my work that not all the women I work with and senior leaders are my sponsors or my mentors or whatever. They're people who maybe...
Nor should they necessarily be so, just by virtue of the fact that they're women, you see, because it goes both ways. I've had colleagues who have studied this very directly, you know, this whole thing. There is a big... sometimes stereotype, sometimes reality that women are each other's worst enemy and don't support each other. It turns out that that is more so the case in contexts where there are very few in positions of power, because the message that is conveyed is that you're not going to make it. There are very few of you are going to make it, and there's no point competing with the men. The competition is with each other. And so that will vary a lot by context. But I think a very important thing is to realize that the best mentor, the best sponsor, the best supporter isn't necessarily going to be somebody who is like you on gender, and that she probably has 100 other people trying to get mentored and sponsored by her because she's the only one, and she may still be kind of struggling with legitimacy and credibility issues herself at her level. And so there's a lot going on that you may not be privy to that is accounting for some of that dynamic that may have nothing to do with competitiveness, may have a lot to do with busyness and lots of demand, lots of taxes on our time as women. As more women become more senior, we're asked to be, you know, the gender representative on everything. And so I think that is a big part of what's playing into what we sometimes call that competitive dynamic.
Hi, thanks very much. I had two questions. The one is how I've looked around the room and I noticed that this is a very majority woman seminar. And actually, how do we get men to come and listen, to even have the debate about changing roles and behaviour and numbers? And the second one is, how much do you think the reality of the choice of having children and the investment of time one wants to make in them affects the numbers and the way they surface at the top? and whether you don't have to have quite strong policy and action by male leaders to create a joint attitude to caring and the family role, and that issue affects how many women get there. Because at the end of the day, if you can't put in the hours with your competition, you're not going to get that job that man sitting working 24 hours for, and you actually do want to go home and not ignore your children.
Right. So first of all, it looks to me like there's lots of men here, and it's, I haven't counted exactly, but I see quite a number, which is encouraging and great. So that's one thing. On your second question, there's lots of aspects to that. One of the things that we need to understand is that the way we work and the way work is structured and the way organizations are set up is a leftover from the 1950s, when people worked very differently. They worked for less time. When there was a division of labor, one person did the breadwinning, the other person held down the fort. And we have a lot of systems in place from a very different time and age. And so until we start to really look more dramatically at how we restructure work, we're not going to get anywhere, because what is absolutely impossible is to have two people in a dual career situation working as if they were the only breadwinners and having children. That gets extraordinarily hard. Some people manage it, but it gets extraordinarily hard. And so for me, the place to begin is, how do we do work, and how do we do it differently today when technology facilitates a lot of different things, first of all. And second of all, how do we continue to evolve on the issue of gender roles and who does what outside of work, and why is it that women should always pay the penalty of who is able to stay late or not? It's partially an organizational issue, but it's also partially a dual career and couples and family issue, and how you negotiate that, and are we able to evolve in a different way?
Thank you very much for your presentation. But there is an assumption that women are willing to access the senior positions. But what if their preferences might be slightly different? Because senior positions also imply lots of responsibility, allocation of lots of time, and also stress. So what if women at a certain point of their careers, they decide to allocate more time and their emotions and energy to their family and other things, given their intrinsic characteristics or family relations?
Well, I don't know about intrinsic characteristics, but I think that certainly there are women who don't want those big mega roles. Personally, I wouldn't want to be a CEO of a large company. I don't want to work around the clock. And there's lots of men who don't want those roles either. And people should and can be able to choose. I see a lot of women who want those roles and who don't get the opportunities to go for them. And I also see, not in my own, but you see studies of men and women going into an organization and into a management and leadership track with very similar levels of ambition, and it plummeting for women as a result of experiences like some of the ones that I have discussed. And so all I'm asking is, can we organize things such that those who really want to make those sacrifices and make those kind of investments are able to do so, should they have the capacity and the desire and the ambition to do so? But there's loads of men who don't want that either. Let's do one more. One last question.
Something you said earlier about how the research that shows the power of even hanging a woman leader's portrait on the wall and the impact it has on women. And I think we've talked a lot about very important things this evening, like the disadvantages and the gaps. And I was wondering if there's any findings, even just small things that seem superficial, like the portrait anecdote that you shared, just behaviours or tactics or things that you've found that women can use that are really effective or helpful or successful.
To do what?
To help them grow as leaders or progress in an organisation, or close those gaps?
The three, I mean, it's a great closing question. The three things that I've been hammering since Tuesday. One is, how do we redefine what we do, get into the more mission critical roles, projects, task forces. If it's not the day job, add something that's going to stretch you, that's going to help you learn, that's going to get you closer to some of the most strategically important things that are happening in your organization or in your industry. How do you stretch what you do? How do you extend your network so that it puts you in touch with not just mentors and sponsors, but people who will inspire you, peer groups, people you can kind of bounce ideas, kindred spirits, expand your mindset. And three, how do you be a little bit more open and playful about who you are and who you might become, so that you allow yourself to try things that don't necessarily come naturally for the sake of learning how to be effective in all of these different contexts that we've been talking about. But those are really, at the individual level, those are really the three levers. At least I'm convinced of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Herminia. I think this was a marvelous roundup. Thank you for the talk tonight, but also for your responsiveness and thoughtfulness in responding all the various questions that we threw at you, not just tonight, but across all the different evenings. Thank you very much for sharing your time and insight with us. Thank you.